Wilson with you as always. We are here on the strategy session tonight in preparation for the moment of truth coming up in a few short hours of Donald Trump doing his State of the Union or joint address to Congress in the wake of a disastrous rollout on tariffs, a moment of pure international arson and lunacy last Friday in the Oval Office. And Joe and I, Stuart is off tonight. He's in an exotic foreign land. But Joe and I are joined tonight by the great Tom Nichols, an observer of American foreign and defense policy like few others. And Tom, it is an honor to have you on the show as always. And I wanted to start out by getting your take. And I've read your take, which I thought was quite brilliant in the Atlantic. But tell people where you see the American alliance with Europe, with NATO, and our this tenuous moment with Ukraine that we're in right now. How do you see this playing out in the coming days and weeks?
We're in a pretty dangerous spot because, the first Trump administration, the Europeans, and there were sensible Americans who also convinced the Europeans of this, but the Europeans were able to convince themselves to say, this is a one-off, it's a fluke. The Americans and their crazy electoral college, weird things can happen. We can tough it out. We can talk to the Americans who are still in the foreign policy bureaucracy, that ugly word, the Defense Department, intelligence community, and so on. This time, I think the Europeans are saying, look, this is just the world we have to live in now. And not because the majority of Americans don't care about their European allies, right, but because the American people, I think the Europeans are saying the American people can kind of go bonkers on occasion and produce just enough votes in just enough states to get these outcomes. And we're going to have to start thinking about that being the real world now, instead of this kind of fluky situation that we had. So I think a couple of things. One is that ironically, I keep saying the way our allies are rising to this moment in Germany and Britain and France tells me that we chose our allies wisely, that actually they're pretty good allies because they're doing the right thing even without us.
Right.
Bad allies just run for the tall grass when something like this happens. But these guys are stepping up and saying the right things. I mean, our sister country, Canada, saying we love you, but this is not. We're not going to play ball on this kind of crazy stuff.
Right.
The other thing I think, though, is that the Russians are now just sitting back and calibrating. When is the time to really, up the slaughter to the point where they can somehow impose a domestic political cost on Zelensky? I'm not sure that Zelensky is as vulnerable as they may think. Actually, Trump blowing up at him created a kind of rally around the flag moment back in Ukraine, where when Brett Baer asked Zelensky on Fox News, he said, well, are you thinking about apologizing to the president? And Zelensky, despite his, imperfect command of English, I think made the point, well, it's like, no, I'm the president of Ukraine. My people would be very mad at me for apologizing to Donald Trump. This isn't, I don't work for you guys. I don't, I'm not the president, the vice president, or the secretary of Ukraine in this country. And so, but I think that this is, a sign to the Russians. And of course, Trump cut off military aid today. So, we're in for some pretty hellish days, I think, in Ukraine, as soon as the Russians can figure out the timing of this. But that's where I think we stand. Our alliances are coming unglued. Not because our allies want them to, but because they've just had to take into account that the American people, can claim to be mad about eggs and then, vote for a guy that wants to trash NATO. And also that they live next to the Russians. I mean, when we talk about the Europeans, we're not just talking about, Britain on its sceptered isle. We're talking about Poland and, Germany and Belgium and Holland and other places that are, within reach of all of this mayhem. And so I'm glad that they're doing the right thing, but it is breaking my heart and making me feel kind of humiliated that they're having to do it without us.
Joe?
Yeah, I thought your piece that it's an ambush. It was an ambush is like really impactful, and people should, if you haven't read it, should read it. But I think I reposted it with it wasn't just an ambush on Zelensky, it was an ambush on the free world and our allies, that they, as much as they kind of, I think you're right, kind of expected that this crazy thing was happening, that all of us, including our allies, were caught completely off guard. I mean, it really is just amazing seeing but as you point out, the reaction and standing tall and standing firm and not caving into it is also just exactly right. That we chose our allies right well.
The other thing that's really striking about this, it's not just that Trump is putting distance between us and our allies or telling them to, pick up the burden or do their fair share. He changed sides.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, Donald Trump is on the side of Russia. There's no subtlety about this at all. I mean, he has made his decision. This administration, again, I keep saying the country, but most people in America don't agree with what he's doing. But this administration has decided to be an ally of the Kremlin. I never thought I would say. I can't believe I'm saying that. I can't believe it's a Republican administration, but here we are. And I think that shock is still kind of setting in both here in the United States and in Europe, that it wasn't just we have second thoughts, we don't want to spend this kind of money, we don't, we have worries about Zelensky. Donald Trump has picked sides. My colleague and my friend David Frum had a great line. He said, anybody who doubted the whole Russia collusion theory is now getting to watch it play out in real time, like literally happening in front of your eyes.
Tom, you and I both come from that sort of last generation of young Cold Warriors window where we were there at the end of the Soviet Union. We were there at that moment where the Soviet Union collapsed, and the predicates, the most fundamental predicate inside of that collapse of the Soviet Union in many ways was that NATO was an impervious, inviolable alliance. It was not going to break. And as much as they tried, in their last gasp in the 80s to split NATO apart and all those things, it never worked. But one guy made it happen for them. The Russians have got to be thinking right now that this is the greatest diplomatic and intelligence coup of all time. There's nothing that rivals this in the history of Russia's quite exceptional, history of turning key people in governments. No one's ever been at this level before. And I'm agnostic as to how they got it, as to how they turned him and made him do this. But the evidence of it is so unbelievably brutally clear now. I wonder how you think that folks inside the military and folks inside the intelligence community are looking at this moment, because I think we are 5 minutes away from Tulsi Gabbard saying, here are the crown jewels, Vladimir. And Pete Hegseth is saying, we're going to start flying, cap missions,
escort missions,
Ukrainians from bombing Russia.
Yeah. Two things, Rick, you're, as you say, you and I come from that last generation. I was working for a Republican senator into the spring of 1991, and that Christmas, the Soviet Union fell.
Yep.
So, our first part of our professional lives was not Russophobic, because I always had great affection for
the Russians. I love Russians.
Mm-hmm.
I love Russians.
It's not their government. So, that's why I try and as often as I say the Kremlin, because there's a lot of people in Russia who unfortunately are okay with this, but a lot more I think who aren't.
Right.
But your point about this being a coup, a diplomatic coup, if you go back to 1918, right, when the Bolsheviks pull out of World War I and the Allies invade Russia, American troops, in Russia, and British troops and so on, it has been a goal for over 100 years of whoever is in the Kremlin to get the Americans out of Europe. Mm-hmm. To get them away from Europe, even after we were allies in World War II.
Yep.
And, open the second front. I take nothing away from the valor of the Soviet fighting man between 41 and 45.
Sure.
But, Lend-Lease, the blood and treasure the Americans brought into this, fighting a two-front war and so on. even after that, the goal was destroy the Western alliance, get the Americans off the continent, send them back home. It never worked, no matter what they did. And Putin, who is really a Soviet guy to his bones, not a Russian nationalist. He's not an Orthodox Christian nationalist. This guy, he's a Savok. He's an old Soviet guy who just is a product of the system. And he did it. He did it. 100 years of job number one of every leader in the Kremlin, and he's got it at this now. It's not a done deal. I think before anybody out there panics, and we're talking about NATO as if it is of blessed memory. He's gotten this distance, although he's also gotten it after NATO has enlarged to 32 members, including Finland and Sweden. Yeah. NATO, even without the United States, is a pretty goddamn formidable. It's the most powerful alliance in the history of human existence.
No question.
So, Donald Trump saying, I don't like NATO anymore, isn't going to somehow leave Europe defenseless, but it is going to increase the peril if the Russians decide, as Putin, I think, will, because Putin is a really lousy strategist and, vain and emotional and, not the most reliable guy, not the most stable guy. He may try and test that and thinking, well, the Americans are gone. Now we can move forward. By the way, historical Cold War historian footnote, exactly the same reasoning that led into the Korean War. The minute the Americans were gone from the peninsula, that's when Stalin said, all right, fine, go. Let's give it a go. But getting rid of the Americans has long been that goal. And I think, to go back to your other question, Rick, about the military, I think in the intelligence community, there is probably nothing but horror and seasickness and, really just because those guys live and breathe compliance with, you and I both know this. We both worked, in secure environments. That you live and breathe that every day about protecting classified information, the whole
sources and methods.
Right. Sources and methods, national technical, all that stuff. I think that probably is true as well in at least some in the military, but I think there are people in the military who are probably fist pumping, Donald Trump and saying, because he has his fans in the military. He just does. There's not a lot of them, but as I wrote a year and a half ago when I was writing about Trump's effect on the military, there doesn't have to be a lot of them to really screw up the U.S. military. There are just enough of them in the right places and at the right ranks to then use the chain of command and obedience to hierarchical discipline to really turn that situation in the military into a nightmare. So I think most people in the military are probably pretty worried about this, but don't discount the fact that there are probably some senior military officers who think this is just fine.
Joe, go ahead.
I was going to say, because you just triggered this whole, when you see the Kremlin spokespeople saying that Trump's foreign policy now aligns with their vision of the future is like, so you think of those intelligence officers you're talking about. It's just, that has to just send chills through all of them.
Everything you've worked for your whole life is now being, sort of thrown out the back door. And for what? This is really the important point. For what? Because we've made a strategic calculation? No, because the historical circumstances, or as the Soviets used to call it, the correlation of forces around the world has somehow changed in some important way? No. It's purely because of the petty ego and vengeful resentment of one man, putting the entire country at risk and putting millions, billions potentially, at risk around the world because he's just angry at Ukraine for not helping him investigate Joe Biden.
Right. Tom, one of the things that I've been contemplating lately is, I don't think either one of us expected to see donkeys in the Russian order of battle again. They are pretty tapped out in terms of manpower, pretty tapped out in terms of armor, pretty tapped out in terms of their frontline air systems now. they've got a shit ton of missiles and a lot of Iranian drones. But there was an argument a Ukrainian made to me the other day that, if we had kept up the tempo for 5-6 more months, these guys are running out of airspeed and ideas. And I'm curious if you think there's some scenario where Europe and look, the European manpower equation is shit. It's awful in terms of as somebody said, it's hard for the Brits to muster an entire division. But do you see a scenario where the Europeans can flood the zone enough with anti-air and with additional artillery equipment and supplies, enough to keep Ukraine in the running here, to stress Putin further? Because Russia has been economically beaten to hell because of this. And it looks like the Europeans are about to snatch $200 billion of oligarch money and give it to Ukraine. Do you see a scenario where Ukraine survives this thing?
Well, it depends on what you mean by survives, Rick. Will there be? I think if Putin has his way, Ukraine, I hate using air quotes, but survives as a kind of rump state, right?
Sure.
Shorn of a partitioned state that Putin then says, see, this isn't really a state. This is just the remnants of a state. And once we're rested up, we're just going to keep going. And then Kiev really will fall and we'll just incorporate this. And it'll be, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine back in the family the way it should always have been. I think, could the Europeans flood the zone and do this? Maybe, but we have to engage in some dynamic modeling here.
Sure.
What will they be doing while the United States is engaging in all kinds of mischief on the other side? I mean, can we keep up the pressure? And I wrote about this about a month ago when I said, we're letting our boot off the neck of the Russians right at the time they need a break.
Yeah.
Economically, we're not even over there fighting. We're giving the Ukrainians the tools to do what they need to do. And we're using the tools at our disposal in the international economy to keep the Russians, in a fairly precarious economic situation. But it doesn't help if the Europeans apply pressure on one end and the Americans do everything they can to let it out on the other end. The Putin is not going to fall. Of course, that's always something you say about a dictator, and then the next day he falls. But there's no indication right now that Putin's in an unstable situation. But Russians are unhappy. This is taking a toll. Sanctions are hurting the Russian economy, and that hurts the Russian war machine. So I hope the Europeans do this, and I hope they flood the zone with all the weapons the Ukrainians need. Because the Ukrainians, there's an upper limit on manpower in Ukraine as well.
Sure.
Except that they live there and they're defending their own homes rather than getting conscripted. I just have to digress for a moment and say, J.D. Vance pointing the finger at Zelensky and saying, you're conscripting people to send them to the front lines. And, poor Zelensky could have said one of two things. One, as I said in my article, oh, you mean like you Americans did in Vietnam?
Right.
You've conscripted people and sent them to the front lines to fight Russian-backed troops. But the other would be to say, I'm conscripting people to send them to the front lines of their homes in their own country. Putin's conscripting people by the thousands, tens of thousands, driving young men out of his own country and sending them to the front lines to fight, alongside North Koreans. Like, how precarious is your situation when you're saying, boy, I hope the North Koreans show up and really help me out here.
Battle-hardened North Koreans.
Yeah, Jesus. And I mean, it just shows you that Vance was just there to be a troll.
Oh, yeah. Joe, go ahead.
No, that's right.
Anyway, sorry.
Vance, who definitely, I just can't make up. I mean, you can't make up the shift that guy has made in particularly on this issue on Ukraine, and to sit there and challenge Zelensky on it was just. But we can go into that Oval Office meeting. It was insanity. The one thing is in Trump's head, is this like, you take Ukraine, I'll take Greenland, You guys take Taiwan. The three of us can, I've got or is there any weird strategy like that? Yeah, we partition the. I mean, I just cannot. Something else.
Let's always remember what all three of us here know and have known since forever, even before he ran. Donald Trump is a weak, scared man,
right?
And he likes to be in the company of strong. A weak bully likes to be around stronger bullies, and feel like part of that club. And you can hear this almost longing when Trump talks about it, about Putin and President Xi and, my friends. And he wants to be part of that club where of men that he thinks just sit around and kind of order things like Zeus throwing thunderbolts, He aches for that because he's always trying to fill that deep maw of insecurity that dogs him every day. So, Joe, maybe he thinks that I don't think he really thinks we're good. I shouldn't say that. Maybe he really does think we're going to get Greenland and Canada or whatever. But I think he does feel like if I give you Ukraine and I get out of your way, we're buddies, right? We're co-equals. We're fellow tough guys. And I think it's, Rick, earlier you were asking, why is he like this? I think part of it is insecurity, and I think he's just afraid of Putin. I mean, I think there's, he fears strong people. And I think that's one of the reasons he really dislikes Zelensky. I mean, he just is not comfortable with people who are brave and principled.
Right.
It's why he was so deeply uncomfortable standing in Arlington National Cemetery.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You can always go through Trump's history, and he is drawn to the Roy Cohns. He is drawn to the Roger Stones. He's drawn to the ugly, seamy types that he has this belief in his mind, Steve Bannon, that they can somehow elevate him to a level where he has the power of the dictator, where he has the power of the strongman, where he's not
afraid anymore, where he's not scared and insecure anymore. I mean, it really kills me how often people talk about what a tough guy Trump is, when everything about him, his statements, his body language, just projects fear and insecurity constantly. But I think that's a big part of this equation. I think Putin had him figured out a long time ago. I think Putin managed to, put the headlock on him in Helsinki years ago. There was one clip from that trip, or maybe it might have been a broader European trip, but where they were at dinner together, and you could see Trump constantly trying to catch, like he was almost like a fangirl. He kept trying to catch his eye, and hey, and that's my pal. I mean, it was really, look, I have my problems with Barack Obama, a guy I did not vote for. But I kind of always liked that Barack Obama's attitude toward Putin was kind of cool, reserved contempt.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
I always thought on that, Obama got it exactly right. Just sort of gave him this look like, yeah, whatever. I know what you are. Trump is, wants to please him. And unfortunately, wanting to please this dictator is now gambling with the fate of, 30, 40 million people in Ukraine and millions more around the world.
And humanity, largely, there's a piece of news I have had now. One source called me on it just before the show. While we were talking, I've had two separate messages from reporters asking me if I am hearing that Trump is going to announce tonight that we will be leaving NATO in some meaningful way, or U.S. troops will be leaving NATO. I don't know if this is a real thing yet, but people are chasing the story. What happens, do you guys think, tomorrow morning in the stock market and around the world if Donald Trump announces tonight that America is pulling our manpower out of Europe?
I'll say the counterintuitive thing and say not much, because I think the market has proven in the past month that by and large, it tries not to take Donald Trump too seriously.
Right.
When he does something concrete, right, like tariffs,
right,
then, the tariffs exist. They're real. For now, of course, Lutnick tonight was already.
Lutnick was walking back after
maybe we're not going to do that.
It's.
So I don't know what happens to the markets, and I think it's important for viewers to understand Trump can't unilaterally leave NATO. It's a treaty. The Senate, we've passed another law saying you can't leave NATO without us, without the Senate. Of course, with this Senate and the Republicans in charge, Trump could pretty much do anything he wants because this Senate has decided that.
I gotta wonder if that's the bridge too far for these people.
You know what, Rick? If you're talking about bridges too far, I have 30
a lot of shit in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, we've been talking about
mirror. Exactly.
Yeah, we've got 100 bridges that were too far. But
he can do one thing. He can pull troops out.
That's what I was going to ask.
He's the commander in chief. He can say, "Fine, we're still in NATO." And NATO, our contribution in NATO is 2 sergeants on a soda machine and some air traffic controllers at Ramstein. Good luck.
Right. Joe, you were saying.
No, that's what I was going to. That was actually the question I was going to ask Tom.
Well, it is. I think tonight is going to be quite a roller coaster ride as we go into this thing. I think we just lost Joe. Tonight's going to be a hell of a roller coaster ride. But Tom, I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight and talking through some of this stuff with our folks. We appreciate you very much. Folks, you can find Tom at The Atlantic, where he writes one of the most brilliant and insightful series of columns on American foreign policy, our place in the world, diplomacy, military, and strategic questions that I consume like an industrial vacuum cleaner. So, Tom, with that, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Hey, folks, do not be shy. Follow us on all the social media platforms. You can also check out my podcast at The Enemies List and the Lincoln Project podcast. Joe Trippi has That Trippi Show. Maya May has Punching Up, which is a phenomenal rising podcast where she talks to a lot of comedians and really thoughtful people about how to respond to this moment we're in. And, of course, Decoding Fox News with Julie Jeske. Folks, thank you for watching. Go watch the State of the whatever the hell it's going to be, and we will talk to you again next Tuesday. Thanks again.